The first meeting of the American Society for Blood and Marrow Transplantation was called to order at 8:30 a.m. on Saturday, February 27, 1993, at the Oak Brook Hills Hotel, Oak Brook, Illinois. At the opening of the meeting, Richard Champlin, M.D., who organized the meeting, called for discussion regarding the need for a bone marrow transplantation society and potential objectives which might be established as goals for this organization.
Well, there was tremendous growth and development in the field of hematopoietic transplants during the 1980s and early 90s, but it was clear at that time that none of the major societies, such as ASH and ASCO, had a consistent and focused interest in the field of hematopoietic transplantation, and it struck me that we needed such an organization to advocate for the field, to represent us, particularly in the evolving discussions regarding managed care and transplantation and the whole delivery of health care, and also with the Food and Drug Administration that had shown interest that they continued since that time to regulate the field. So it was clear to me that we needed an organization that could effectively advocate and support the development of hematopoietic transplantation.
You know, the funny thing about this meeting is as you talk to this group of founders, the recollections of what happened 10 years ago are rather slim. And I actually, in my own mind, I've sort of merged the first two meetings together. But Dick called me up one day and said, we really needed to do something to provide a framework for our activities. Transplantation has become increasingly important in hematology and oncology. In fact, I think at the American Society of Hematology, at least a quarter of the abstracts are stem cell transplantation.
Well, I had talked to the major leaders in the field that I could identify during the year really preceding our organizational meeting to try to engender support and their interest in the society. There was, in fact, uniform support to go forward with this organization. We finally did organize the meeting that was held here in the Chicago area, and I tried to have the major leaders and representatives of the major transplant centers participate so we could be sure that there was broad-based involvement and support.
Over the next 2 hours, a series of issues were discussed to gain a consensus of the objective of the society. Discussions centered on the need for a national organizational voice, which could promote clinical and basic research into both allogeneic and autologous marrow transplantation.
Well, it was interesting that of the people, all the people who attended the meeting, many had totally different priorities in their mind than I did. I was personally more concerned about the organizational, regulatory, insurance industry interactions that the field of hematopoiesis was and hematopoietic transplantation was facing. Others, I remember Dr. Kersey was most concerned about science and wanted to be sure that the society fostered science and supported scientific programs. And that, again, has become a major aspect of the society going forward. And we've been very successful in developing both the journal and the annual meeting that has been now become really the preeminent meeting for a focused transplantation presentations.
I give a lot of credit to the presidents and the secretaries and the treasurers in the early days because we had nothing. We had to write a constitution. We had to get lawyers. We had to hire an executive director. We had to start a journal. We had to do all of the nuts and bolts activities that which nobody was recognized for. I mean, I think if you polled the membership of the ASBMT, 1% or less have any clue as to what type of who was participating in all those things and what type of work it was for no pay and no recognition. So it was really a labor of love for the field that got this thing going.
Anytime you try to do anything new, there's always people who disagree. And there certainly were people at the time that felt that we didn't need yet another society or yet another journal. Those people actually have come around over time, and I think right now there's pretty uniform acceptance and really enthusiasm regarding the organization.
It was agreed by the committee to take steps to incorporate the society as a non-profit organization and to seek members among clinicians and scientists who had demonstrated interest and expertise in marrow transplantation. either as a field of research or as a clinical discipline. It was agreed that the proposed organization be named the American Society for Blood and Marrow Transplantation. It was agreed to organize the society to include...
Well, we actually had a lot of discussion. Actually, we changed the name, I think, during the meeting. We started out as American Society for Bone Marrow Transplantation. And we said, well, the field is changing rapidly to blood stem cells. And so we sort of on the spot changed it to blood and marrow transplants. And actually, we're quite happy that we at least could keep the same initials and still have that message.
A series of necessary objectives prior to the first general meeting. The financing of the society was discussed at length. It was agreed that established transplant centers be requested to donate $1,000 each as seed money for the establishment of the society. It was agreed that...
Of course, we didn't have any money. We didn't have any organization. I actually went to the bank and opened a bank account for the society, and we actually appealed to the major centers to actually make donations to get us off the ground and give us a little startup capital. So for the first 3 years, I believe we got major donations from individual transplant centers to get the organization started.
The other thing that John Kersey remembers in particular, we were acutely aware of, was the extreme poverty of the society. Is that a legitimate statement, John?
I tell you, we were always in the red. We didn't know what black was. We only knew red. One color.
Well, I can remember at the Fontainebleau in Miami, we didn't, because of we had moved the meeting into the winter, and because of the proximity to ASH and to some extent the EBMT meeting, people were just not signing up until January or in that range. And so we were heading into the Fontainebleau meeting with a penalty, substantial penalty, something like $20,000, of which we had no money. And fortunately, right at the last minute, the enrollment picked up, and we met our room goal. We were very hand to mouth in those days.
I was trying to think back, and the early years of society reminded me of when I was an intern and got paid $3,000. And when you look back in those days, you realize you had no money, and so there were a bunch of things you just didn't think about doing but it wasn't bad times. I mean, you sort of live within the reality of that, and that was really the society. And I can always remember Karl saying he wanted 96 or 128 pages for the journal, and just saying, but Karl, we can't afford to do 96 or 100, because we were barely stable and we didn't have the money. But I think that the fun of those days was almost the poverty, because
it's generally my experience that poverty is a lot more fun in retrospect.
That's true. That's right. We laugh now. We didn't laugh so much then, but we laugh now about it.
I think you were lucky though. The whole organization and all of you who are so critical and so very committed in an active way in the beginning had the blessing of having mission and excitement, and that in the end may be as important or more important than prosperity. So.
Proposed that a committee be charged with the planning and implementation of a scientific journal for the society. Several options for a journal were discussed. There was a general consensus that a separate and independent journal be established as the official publication of the society. It was further recommended.
The journal was a struggle to get established. It always is with any new scientific journal. Sullivan took the lead in terms of identifying a publisher, and the whole group really worked hard to negotiate the contract. That's been a somewhat difficult issue over the years in terms of how the revenues of the journal would be applied. Anytime one starts a new journal, the challenge is to get really the best papers submitted to that journal, because there's a tradition to sending them elsewhere, of course, before the journal is established. And Dr. Blume and Dr. O'Reilly did a great job in getting things off the ground, and that journal has continued to improve and flourish, and really has been a very high-quality vehicle for publication of research related to this field, and we're very proud of it.
Well, it was clear that societies formed a natural home for a scientific journal, and at that time we felt that there really wasn't one for hematopoietic stem cells. And with that in case, the question was, do you go to a publishing house? Do you do self-publications? Many of us had sat on other editorial boards where these discussions were evolving. And so I think that we were really, in some ways, neophytes in the business aspect of setting up a journal, and thus brought in several outside vendors to make presentations and look at the business aspects. And in the beginning, we just didn't have much in the Treasury. And so here you are, you have a good idea, you don't have necessarily a funding stream, and you have major players. So the question was, who's going to help us in that? And most importantly, who's going to be the editor or editors? And I think that it was really a consensus, and I think brilliant, that we had complementary strengths of having co-editors with Rick Riley and Karl Blume. And that really, I think, saved us, because that, again, spoke to the quality issue, the quality of the papers, and the attracting of manuscripts.
The fact of the matter is, when we were drawing up the whole idea of the journal, the central issue was that we wanted to have papers that would be the best in the basic science of it and the clinical science, and in particular try to foster the communication between the two in terms of translational work. And so we agreed to a very high bar. That was a very difficult thing to pull off early on in a journal, in terms of getting the kinds of papers that were good, because we would get several papers that we just didn't feel were good enough, and we sort of held to that.
I remember the afternoon I got the telephone call from Keith telling me that my name had been proposed to be an editor of the journal, and I was flattered, but I also knew it would be difficult to establish a new journal. But he said, you don't have to do it by yourself. You'll have help from New York. Richard is the other guy. And so Richard and I started to talk about it, and on one of the visits to the US Open, Richard and I were sitting in his fabulous office looking over one of the rivers there and putting together an editorial board. And there was, in fact, the selection of the real best people in the field, and everyone whom we asked to be either an associate editor or an editorial board member agreed. And so we were quite excited, and were successful in getting the first issues out in the first year, and then in the second year it looked also quite good, and then came this disastrous third year. We were waiting every morning for the mail, and no manuscript came, and next day no manuscript. And at the end of the year we had either only 2 or 3 issues, and that had all the flavor of a dying journal. And then somehow we stuck to our policy that we would only take things which were worth the paper it would be printed on. And a few very good articles came in, and that turned it around, and then we went up to 6, and then up to 12 issues, and then Bob Korngold came to our rescue, because I think by that point we were both exhausted, having done the journal for 7 years, and Bob then has made something even much better out of it, and it's now a terrific journal, and I was very proud to see that.
I'll add a confession. The one thing I didn't think you were going to be able to do, Karl and Rick, was create a high-quality journal. When I heard the society, when I realized the society was going to put together a journal, it's like, oh my God, one more piece of print that will kind of pass across my desk into the ultimate receptacle. And I have been absolutely astounded at how you held the line through the thin years when there weren't very many papers, not filling it with trash, so that it became a really good journal that is a real contribution to the field. And that was not something I thought could be done.
And it's during a decade when above average journals are being trashed.
Yeah.
They're disappearing.
Really.
libraries aren't subscribing, and
Quite so.
going through this revolution in communication, and it was all uphill.
Council were reviewed and approved. The first scientific meeting of the Society is targeted for the fall of 1995. Alternatively, a separate venue.
But an important aspect has been the partnership with the registry for the tandem meetings. In the initial years of the Society, we had an independent meeting, and that was difficult to get people to attend yet another meeting when they had to go both to ASH and then separately to a registry working meeting. Over the last years, when we've had the tandem meetings in combination with IBMTR, it really has more than doubled the registration and has really allowed complementary functions to occur. The science of the ASBMT presentations, along with the working organizational aspects for the registry. So it really has been a boon, I think, for both organizations. What would you say, Mary?
Oh, I think it allowed both organizations to have a meeting that combined basic and clinical science in a way that I don't think would have been possible doing independently. And I think not only has the meeting been good for both of our organizations, but it's now become a place where many other organizations come together, and where there really is a very good mix of science, of basic science and clinical science. And I think neither one of the two organizations could have had a meeting like this independently.
I think
it's really
that was,
one of our accomplishments.
that was a really wise decision.
Allogeneic and autologous marrow transplantation, and provides standards for the training of individuals in marrow transplantation, as well as general standards of care in this complex discipline.
Another major success for the Society has been the FACT organization and the development of training, recommendations, and guidelines and standards for transplant centers. And that although it's been always a painful process for each center to go through that accreditation process, I'm impressed that it's really raised the standards of care as each center has had to address their own organization and standards and prepare for that inspection. One has improved your own internal processes, and that every center, even the most prestigious, have had issues raised in the course of their review that has led to improvements in their own program. So that process has been very good to set a standard for transplant centers throughout the country and to improve the existing standards of care at every center.
I think that's a really important point, because if you look at our original minutes, we had some goals. You've heard some of the scientific and translational goals, the publications and the editorial board and the annual meetings, but it really boiled down to issues of patient safety and continuous improvement in transplant centers. And this was at a time when there were regulatory movements to say this is what a standard for stem cell should be, the definition of the product, things like that. And I think that an example, the surveys that we did, what are standards and what can we do to put down safety standards for administration of high-dose chemotherapy was a positive influence. The generation of FACT as a sister society, if you will, to do internal regulations and inspections. This was at a time when I remember one center, when this was evolving, one center had a wonderful story of saying that they had just had a visit by a federal or national regulatory agency and an established center, and the inspector was very impressed, and at the end of the day, the inspector said, "Gee, doctor, you have a wonderful program, but how do you get enough volume out of the spinal fluid to do those cord blood transplants?" And we knew at that time it was something that people in the field who had put their life and scientific experience here really needed to come together and do regulatory, self-regulatory, and the directions of the field. That's been probably one of the hardest things over the last 10 years. And I think that a society such as ASBMT, and the friendships that have been formed across different centers is an invaluable resource to go ahead and do that. I think that's our job continuously. And as every new aspect, whether it's non-ablative transplants or whatnot, what can we do to make it safer for the patient? What can we do to standardize our procedures?
As I think back over what we were thinking 10 years ago, transplantation was a little bit wild and woolly. You know, you could set up a transplant program on a shoestring and basically call yourself a transplanter, and you were one. I can remember doing consultations for insurers at the time, which were in essence vetting newly started transplant programs. So Prudential or Travelers would call me and say, well, what do you think about these guys? And they would send me their CVs and such. And in fact, many of them had had no formal training in transplantation. They simply were going out, setting up a program and performing. And that had generated a great deal of concern amongst those of us who did have a more organized and academic approach to it, amongst the insurance companies who didn't really have a good mechanism to determine who was a serious player in this business, who they could trust to provide good medical care to their enrollees. And this is really part of the underlying motivation for FACT. And FACT grew up to establish a set of standards and to provide inspectors in a fairly objective fashion that not only provided a service to the insurers or to the NIH or to whoever else, that is to be able to say that, look, you know, we have been peer reviewed, we are performing up to a certain standard that everybody should be comfortable with. And it's a tough standard and consequently discourages fly-by-night operations. Anybody who has been recently reviewed might wonder about it at the time the review's going on, because it is a bit of a pain. Although my experience, we just had one in June, my experience was an interesting one, which was that we got together, of course, all of the dozens of people that are important in establishing a transplant program and making it function, many of whom had no idea how complicated and how difficult a thing stem cell transplantation is. And when they got into all in one room, and there were dozens of them, to have the sort of the fact exit interviews and such, they were extremely impressed with their own program. And so I think that was a sort of an interesting byproduct of it in terms of sort of team building and our own internal collegiality.
I think the CTN is something that this organization should take credit for as well, because it was a long time coming, and IBMTR was part of the foundation, but it wasn't until you really brought all of the miscellaneous, independent-minded investigators and leaders in the field together, and remember those forums that were held at the tandem meetings? Mm-hmm. I mean, I knew some of the NIH people very well, and I mean, they were watching to see the social dynamics of those meetings, to see if the society really could come together and provide the kind of community support that would be needed to sustain the CTN. I can remember in those years I was spending several times a year arguing with Claude L'Enfant, and he was a great skeptic. And it was interesting, and he had a vision himself that the society would have to develop like, and he was always using the American Association of Cardiology because that was his background. He was saying, you know, this is the most independent, unpredictable, undisciplined group of investigators I've ever seen in my life. You know, and until they could really show us, mm-hmm. and you know, in retrospect, I can see what he was saying now, and he was right in a rather orthodox way, but he was right. That had to happen first. The community had to come together and provide the scientific platform, the scientific foundation for it. But again, with high integrity.
Well, a follow-up story of the tedium of drafting those guidelines and regulatory aspects, and literally we would spend an hour on a paragraph, that sort of thing. Oh. And I remember one meeting we had like in this vein, and Don Thomas showed up, and Don sat down and went through 4 or 5 hours. At the end, I said, Don, what are you doing here? And you know, he said, well, Keith, this is important. If we don't do this, someone will do it for us, and we won't like that product. And so I thought that really was a ratification at a time when I think all of us were saying, is this the sort venue that we should spend our time in scientific focus. And that type of feedback was really important, at least for me.
The major product for fact for me was an understanding of the difference between shall and should.
Right.
Never had I realized that shall and should are really just not the same word.
Well, I think that the most amazing thing is that we ever got together. And you wonder why I say that, but you think about this group, all of you who I consider my friends. We are all very independent spirits. We're independent souls, and we're very, very, very intense in what we do. And part of it is our personalities. Part is our training. Many of us were influenced by people like Bob Good and George Santos and Don Thomas, and these pioneers were people who could argue for hours about something, and we've learned to argue for hours about things as well. And so we're independent. We're doing things that we think are best, and sometimes we can't and don't know how to quite get together. So I think it's unbelievable that we did this.
You know, I have a really different perspective on this field than other people do, because we always say that this is a field of cowboys, you know, of individualists. That's amazing. What?
Gunslingers.
Gunslingers. That it's absolutely amazing that we could come together. I don't see this field that way. And maybe it's because I'm in charge of an organization where people for 30 years, without any pressure of regulation, have shared data on their patients in a very incredibly unselfish way. It is not at all surprising to me that this field came together when it was necessary for that to happen. This is a field, yes, of individuals, of really smart, opinionated, high ego people, but they're smart enough to know to do what they have to do when they have to do it. And if you look at the field, in addition to the IBMTR, and then you look at the ASBMT, and you look at the Clinical Trials Network, I think we have a very admirable history of coming together. And so as you're going around and they say, well, you know, isn't it amazing we got together? I'm not amazed at all. That's how I've seen this field from the beginning.
Good. One of the challenges that I see, and Mary alluded to this a little bit, is the business of physicians, bright young physicians becoming interested and active in clinical research. I think that's a major concern. There are multiple reasons why bright young physicians are not doing this. And it involves financial things, it involves time, it involves concern that they might not get enough papers published to be promoted, just a whole variety of things. And I hope that as a society we can help with this problem, because if we don't have a next generation of people that are leading in this field at the clinical level, we're going to be in trouble. We're going to have some wonderful basic scientists who are doing fantastic basic research, but won't touch this, and we'll have some practitioners who will be out there wanting to practice whatever is available. But the key person, the clinical investigator in the middle, is going to be lacking. So I think anything we can do to help with that is going to be a major step forward.
How does a scientific society, like I said, Mary raised that question a few minutes ago, how do we provide the impetus, the support, how do we advocate for clinical research? And because that perception, I think, is growing, that clinical research in this area, in both stem cell research and gene therapy research, is just too high risk nowadays. Mm-hmm. You want to do something safe, that's a little where you can connect the lines between the career paths more with greater confidence. And to go into clinical research right now it's a daunting undertaking for someone young in the field.
I would say that's a sentinel and seminal issue for this society, of the various pressures on young people to leave clinical research.
The other area, I think, where ASBMT can play an important leadership role is in interacting with other societies. And I think we had an interesting conversation last night about this, and I think that one of the insights that I gained from that discussion is that we need to interact with societies that represent, in terms of scientific integrity and also clinical expertise, areas of transplantation that don't involve hematopoietic cells. And I think that we can be in a leadership position there, because we have this, I think, unique combination of expertise in clinical research as well as fundamental basic science. So that there are many individuals in ASBMT who really understand cell biology. And that may not necessarily be true for individuals in the cardiovascular sciences and in the neurosciences, which clearly are hot areas. I think this is an important area that we should focus on as we go into the future, because I think we have a lot to contribute. And I think also it will continue to revitalize us.
If you look at what's necessary for the field to go forward, our interactions with regulatory agencies have been successful. There are two areas, one of which we've addressed and one of which we haven't addressed at all, that are going to be, at least in my eyes, crucial for the field going forward. First of all is the interactions with the drug companies that we need to develop, and it's not quite clear the CTN is going to be effective in doing this. The issue of for what is, quote, a small market in their terms, to get what they have that we need to, again, to take our ideas and our research into clinical practice. We need a better system about that. And the other, which is going to be crucial, is the issue of nursing. That somehow the society really needs to somehow, whether it's the new bill in Congress, needs to address, because that all of our programs are already at the edge when it comes to nursing, and it's only going to get worse. And the issue of how the society can deal with the nursing issues are going to be crucial for the field to move forward.
The other area, regulatory area, that I think the society has to take a leadership role in is in the regulation of clinical research. We've been talking about the regulation of the product, the regulation of the process of providing stem cells. But the thing about this field, it's moved forward over the past 3 decades because what's happened in the lab has been translated to the clinic rapidly. And now we're seeing that it's harder and harder to do that. And because it's harder and harder to do that, it's hard to keep well-trained clinical scientists interested in the process. And so I think the same principles apply. We want to make sure that volunteers with clinical research are treated in an ethical manner, that their safety is protected, and yet we have to think about the ethics of making regulations so onerous that we're unable to move forward.
My continuing hope since the inception of this thing is that we wouldn't have a circumstance that sometimes happens in organ transplants where you have those who do them and there are those who do the research, and they sort of talk together once a year. One of the beauties of this society so far is that the fact is that the level of integration is very high, but I think that that's going to be a real push to continue to develop that and maintain that vitality.
Being flexible is always an issue for societies when they get to their second decade. We were very flexible in the beginning because there weren't many of us. We didn't have a history. We weren't bogged down by a history. The challenge of staying flexible once you have a certain bureaucracy that's inevitable for functioning is a big one. But the opportunities are so great for the next decade that it will be imperative for us.
Well, quite so. I mean, we already have open protocols that part of the clinical and investigation teams include rheumatologists and neurologists and cardiologists now. I mean, these are really hard areas to go across boundaries and silos, if you will. But unless we really focus on that, specifically bring young investigators in those areas to our meetings and form an inclusive rather than exclusive, that's the challenge, I think, for this society in the next decade, because it's really moving quickly, as everybody said, into areas that we really hadn't anticipated.
I think the society has been successful in every endeavor. You know, the journal, again, is very successful. It's a very high-quality journal, really having the best research in hematopoietic transplantation. The annual meeting has been well-received. It really is now the premier meeting for presentation of research related to hematopoietic transplantation. The other major success of the society is the FACT organization that we co-founded with the International Society for Cell Therapy. This is the accrediting organization now that will voluntarily accredit centers involved in hematopoietic transplantation. And we, as the ASBMT, were integral to the formation of that group. ASBMT also developed the clinical standards and guidelines for training for professionals involved in hematopoietic transplantation, and really has been the voice of the field in terms of establishing standards and guidelines for care.
Well, I think for the foreseeable future, the society has to take the accomplishments of the past 10 years and build on them. And I think that, as Dick pointed out, we've made a tremendous strides in the past 10 years. We have really organized ourselves in a way that we have a lot to be very proud of. If you think back even just a decade ago, transplantation physicians and transplantation centers were disorganized. There was sort of a group of cowboys. People were very egotistical doing what they did, very little in the way of collaboration. And one of the critical functions of the society has been to bring people together, in fact, to allow collaborative studies, which I think have grown out of the collegiality of the meeting and the forum that we use to present our science. A good example of that is the Clinical Trials Network, which in fact grew out of discussions that occurred at the ASBMT annual meetings, and has now evolved into a very functional and what will, I think, for the next decade be sort of the critical outlet of our clinical research activities.
The field of transplantation is going to change going forward. I think we're going to get away from giving high doses of chemotherapy as molecularly targeted and more specific and less toxic drugs are developed. And so the field is going to evolve to immunotherapy and stem cell therapy, and hopefully we'll have a broad application for a wide range of human diseases, not just oncology, but all of the autoimmune diseases, and hopefully tissue repair in general if stem cell treatments really meet the promise that everyone is expecting.
One of the things that differentiates transplantation from the rest of oncology and hematology is our very strong potential for curing somebody. However, you do so at a cost. And if you were to look through the abstracts of our annual meeting, what you'll see is it's a mixture of clinical trials that are designed to minimize the cost to the patient and to maximize the outcomes, as well as basic science, which are going to take us to the next step. Clearly, the ultimate success of a society like this, if we were to look back in 100 years, would be that we wouldn't be doing transplantation at all, that we'll have figured out ways of curing people or preventing these diseases without having to put them through the high-dose therapy or the donor lymphocyte infusions, and graft versus host disease should no longer be an issue for them. We've got a long way to go before we get to that place, and the promise of vaccines and targeted therapy and such has been around for a while, and it's going to take a while before it really makes a significant impact on what we're doing. A new person coming into this area would be excited by really the array of opportunities to take basic observations in biology and in medicine and apply them in a way that have a substantial impact on patients' outcomes. If I think back to the first transplants that I participated in as a resident in the late 70s and as a fellow, let's say, in 1981, the field has grown tremendously since then. When I began, the average length of hospital stay for one of our patients was 100 days. And of course now it's substantially less than that. It's less than 30 days in most places. The morbidity of the transplantation is substantially less, and the outcomes are substantially better. So we need to move to the next step. We're never going to be in the position where we can cure everybody. But the thing that attracted me to the field and why I think it's so dynamic is that there are so many places in hematopoiesis, in pharmacology, in immunology, in radiobiology and such, that everything comes together in a successful way in a significant proportion of the time. And in contrast to some of the other diseases that hematologists and oncologists deal with, we really can see the fruits of our labors in terms of curing some people, which means that if we continue to work at it and we apply ourselves, we should be able to do better and better as time goes on.
Following discussion of the goals established for each committee and agreement both on the agenda and target dates for completion, the meeting was adjourned. Respectfully submitted, Richard O'Reilly, MD, Secretary.